In this video, I will talk about validity in experiments. And as the name suggests, valid means reliable or true. There are several types of validity that I will cover in this video, which pertain mostly to experiments. I'm not covering types of validity that I expected in a survey type of research. And to best remember what validity is all about, try to think of it as a reflection, as you can see on the side, of the phenomena that you are researching relative to the real world or relative to other important aspects that I will talk about just in a few seconds. Again, a bit of a disclaimer. I will show you examples of different experiments which have been carried out by researchers, which were published in academic journals. I'm not endorsing those journals or those papers. I'm just using them as examples for you to understand what type of validity researchers were trying to establish when they use a different type of experimental design. As I mentioned before, an experiment is a method of investigation. In this method of investigation, you are manipulating the levels of your independent variable, just as shown on the screen. I have 4 groups. I have 3 interventions plus a control group, which does not receive any treatment. We have a clear theory about how each of those interventions are expected to affect our dependent variable, which can be anything which makes sense in the discipline that you are studying. It could be knowledge, it could be attitudes, it could be behavior. And because you are manipulating your independent variable, what you want to establish is that it is really the effect of those variables which is responsible for the outcomes you are observing in your dependent variable. And this is exactly what is captured by internal validity. Try to think of it as something which is intrinsically internal, and it is about the manipulations that you are executing and their true effect on your dependent variable. So if I am to visualize it, I will put the boundaries of internal validity around the independent variable and its levels and the dependent variable. Because what it pertains to is actually these causal paths, that it is indeed your independent variables that are responsible for what you are observing when you're measuring the outcome. And this is why the definition of internal validity from Cartas and Her suggests that internal validity is the extent to which the design you use, the method and the procedures that you use during your experiments allow you to conclude that the independent variable really influenced the changes in the dependent variable, whether something increased, whether something decreased, or remained the same. If we go back to the type of the experiment that we should carry out if we want to increase internal validity, you may have already guessed it would be a lab experiment. This is the type of experiment that really allows you to have more controllable procedures that you execute, what they read, what they do, the sequence of the procedures that they go through. And because the lab experiment takes place in a highly controlled environment, and this protocol is repeated in exactly the same way for the next participant who is taking part in your research, it means that the internal validity or your assurance that it's your independent variable that causes changes in the dependent variable is higher. Here I also have an online experiment, but keep in mind that online experiments, they have less control compared to the true lab experiment when people actually physically come into your lab. But I've put it in here because you're still in charge of the procedures, the sequence of questions, how many seconds or minutes they have to remain on that web page before they proceed to the next one. You determine the sequence of all the procedures that they need to go through. So there is a bit of control there, but not as much as you would have in a lab experiment condition. Here is an example of an online experiment where exactly the same procedures were followed from one respondent to the next one. This research project was about the encouragement of end-use consumption, consumers' reuse or upcycling of products that reach the end of their life cycle. And researchers have proposed several interventions. One of them was creativity priming. Another was environmental appeal, which mentioned the amount of waste. Another one was environmental appeal with the examples of the end use consumption. and control group described their typical day. All of these participants, once they were exposed to these procedures, they were asked to generate as many end-use consumption ideas as possible, and then their inspiration was measured, and then the dependent variable was measured. And these are exactly the procedures which we have control of as researchers. The amount of seconds they had to remain on the page before they proceeded to this task, then they had to complete this task before they were allowed to go to the next one, and so on and so forth. This allows us as researchers to be assured that we have higher internal validity. But of course, internal validity would be much higher if they were asked to come into a lab. And because this task was researcher induced, this is actually not the real life consumer process and how they would go naturally about information processing. So in this study, researchers have also conducted the third study where they showed them a metal can, which then had creativity priming embedded in one of the leaflets to approximate the decision-making to real environment where someone would encounter a metal can on a supermarket shelf, and then they would engage with the product, read the leaflet. So this was done to actually show that similar effects are likely to observed in more natural decision making. It's not a field experiment. Don't confuse it with a field experiment. It's a different experiment design. It was done online, but it was done to ensure that exactly same inspiration levels or effect of inspiration on end use would be observed if a more approximated to real life experiment or task is being used by researchers. An important thing to keep in mind when we look at internal validity is confounding or extraneous variables. I have a separate video dedicated to these variables, but if you're not sure what extraneous variables are about, they are the variables that you're not accounting for. They are outside of your experimental manipulation, but they have an impact on what you are observing. Confounding variables represent a subtype of extraneous variables, and they impact both on the independent variable and your dependent variable, which means that confounding variables are a threat to your internal validity. Like I said before, if you're not sure what extraneous and confounding variables are and how to mitigate their effects, in other words, how to improve internal validity, please watch my video. I have a separate video on this channel. And if you're not sure what a lab experiment is, I also have a video for you on this channel. Just to summarize, lab experiments are great because they are high on internal validity, but they can be low on external validity. And this is the concept that I would like to discuss now in more detail. Think of external validity, to remember what it is, as something which is external to your experiment. And I will show you now what I'm referring to. The external validity is basically the extent to which the results that you observed in your experiment can be generalized to other people or to other situations outside your experimental manipulation. So if you want to visualize it, I like to highlight it as something which is going beyond the effect that you've looked at, going beyond your experimental manipulation, and whether these effects, these trends can be observed also in the outside real world. Now, external validity is actually much higher when we conduct a field experiment, because a field experiment is a technique where we measure the dependent variable in a more natural environment. So for you to remember this, try to think of a field experiment as something which happens in a more natural setting. That's why I have those cute yellow flowers for you on the background. If you're not sure what a field experiment is, I have a separate video for you on this channel as a refresher. Why do field experiments have greater external validity? Well, it's because very often participants who take part in the field experiment, they are not aware of the fact that they are taking part in experiment. Another reason is that they're also not aware which manipulations researchers are executing. How many are there? Another important aspect in field experiment is that the actual behavior is measured unobtrusively. Let me show you an example. This example comes from the work which was published in 2017 in the Journal of Public Policy and Marketing by Wen, Mohabadaya, and Patrick. What they were looking at was how to encourage recycling behavior. The example I have here is their first study. And you need to keep in mind that it's actually really good to stagger your experiments for highly ranked journals. Your first experiment can be a lab experiment, and then to prove that similar effects will be observed in a more real setting, then you run your field experiment. And this is why field experiment is their first study, because they first wanted to establish the effect in a lab experiment or in an online experiment. What they were doing to approximate it to real life and to measure behavior really unobtrusively so that people don't know that they are taking part in this research. They have designed special stickers for bins. One of the manipulation contained cute images and active behavioral approach system, and another one had a cute image and a passive behavioral approach system. Active and passive behavioral approach system is a concept from psychology, which is basically about how we respond to rewards, how motivated we are. And they wanted to see which of those interventions is actually resulting in a greater number of recycled materials returned. They ran it for 8 weeks because they were also interested in measuring the wear out effect of their intervention. And they spread those bins on campus in different locations. Of course, participants here were not aware what the manipulation was, and they were not aware that they were taking part in this research, which means that the amount of recycled material which they were measuring from each of those beans, from those manipulations, was measured in a very unobtrusive way. Of course, in this type of a study, it's very challenging to go back and measure psychographic, psychological, or attitudinal variables, but field experiments, they have a different purpose. They want to demonstrate that similar effects will be observed in the natural environment. You may be collecting information about passive or active behavioral approach system through your lab experiment or an online experiment. And in a field experiment, you just prove that the results that you observed in a lab experiment, which has higher internal validity but low external validity, will be observed in a field study which has high external validity. So I hope now you can see how you can stagger and layer your experiments in a very beautiful manner to demonstrate from a more well-rounded perspective the phenomenon that you are studying is valid and reliable. Now I would like to move to the concept of predictive validity, which is used in experimental research. And to memorize what it's all about, I would like to draw boundaries over here. And you can see that this time I have a mediator variable, because predictive validity usually applies to situations when we have a mediator, and it refers to the degree to which scores from a psychological instrument, the measure that we are using, can predict the criterion, the dependent variable that we are measuring in the future. Predictive validity is also important when you have a moderator, because for those moderators and mediators, you may be using scales that consist of more than one item. When it comes to predictive validity, Stoner et al. Recommends researchers to use established scales that have been published in the past, that have been validated. So they are both reliable and valid. This is one of the ways for us to establish that predictive validity could be observed there. And if you read papers that focus specifically on scale development, you will see that they are extremely rigorous. They go through a series of studies and they establish different types of validity sequentially, and this is what makes them reliable and valid. They also go through rigorous peer review process in the journals, and that also increases our assurance among the people who then use those scales that they have gone through a very rigorous validation process. Kamakura also recommends using multiple item scales over single item scales for your moderators, for your mediators, and also for your dependent variable, exactly for the same reason that multiple item scales can create more reliable measures compared to a single item scale. As the final note, Researchers also suggest that when you use moderators, mediators, and dependent variables, which you measure as multiple item scales, to report convergent and discriminant validity in your dissertation or in your paper. There are specific statistical tests which we need to follow to establish convergent validity and discriminant validity. And in this case, your convergent validity loading factor scores should be above 0.70 and average variance extracted should be above 0.5. The discriminant validity, for this one, you need to report cross-loadings, square root of average variance extracted, and they should be above the correlation between the variables. Now, I hope you have a light bubble above your head, you feel empowered, you understand different types of validity, and you are ready to run your experiment.